On the off chance you've never heard of Helm, and if you've been collecting for more than a few years, you really should have by now. But on the off chance you don't, know that they are one of the older micro brands around. I think at this point they've been around for about 10 years, and they are known for having some of the best bang for your buck tool watches around. To the point they've developed an almost cult-like following with massive waitlists, some of which go out years. They also don't release a new watch very often, maybe every 3 years, give or take. So when they do come out with something like they've done now, it's kind of a big deal. So what you're looking at right here is the new Togiak Scout, and it's doubly interesting because this is the first field watch they've ever done. And I have to say, it's very Helm, with all the good and the little bit of bad that comes with that. But as usual, we'll get to all of that. Now, before we get going, I do have a couple of quick notes. So first off, for those of you who are always suspicious of microbrand reviews, know that practically every review out there for a Helm is from someone who's bought one, like I have here. I'm not even sure I've ever seen a Helm review where they sent someone a watch to check out. If anything, maybe Rob's got the connections to do something like that, but he might be the only one. Unlike a lot of other micros out there, Helm isn't actively seeking reviews, and that's because with their massive waitlists, they don't really need to. And the second thing is that Helm actually released 3 different versions of the Togiak, another sort of first for them. There's this version, which is the straight steel field watch. And then there's an Expedition version, which upgrades it to titanium and makes it more of a dive field hybrid. And then there's the UTC version, which just adds the GMT movement to it. And for all of these, know that unlike all their other watches, these aren't ISO rated, which is another first you could say. Now I picked this one just because I thought it was the more interesting one to check out, and it was cheaper. So for the Scout version, Helm went with a very minimalist 39.5mm case paired with a 46mm lug-to-lug, which means this should fit a wide variety of wrist sizes, even for you slim-wristed folks out there. And while the side profile, when you look at this right here, it makes it look really thick. But honestly, it's not that bad. It's just this straight sheer wall makes it look thick. It's not thin at all, but at 13.5mm, it's not overly chunky for a watch with a Seiko NH36. So you could say it's just big boned. Now the other versions will probably be lighter since they are made of titanium. But the steel version here isn't too bad either. On a strap, it's just under 100 grams, and even on its bracelet, it's about 170. And then on my 7.25 inch wrist, after taking some of those links off, I think it's down to about 160. When I first saw it and I thought it looked a bit tall, I was a little bit concerned, but overall it is pretty comfortable throughout the day. It may be just a touch top heavy, just a touch, but overall it's fairly balanced and comfortable. But let's get to the design, and you'll see what I mean when I said this thing is very Helm. Because like every other Helm out there, with maybe the exception of the Miyako, this is a straight tool watch with a slightly interesting design. So since this one's a field watch, they went with an all-blasted case and bracelet. So it's got this very smooth utilitarian gray with no flashy polish anywhere. The only thing that really stands out with the case here is the knurling. The knurling on the screwed down crown and the sides of the very overly pronounced bezel, which I think also helps reinforce that tooly aesthetic. And in some ways, it kind of reminds me of a Citizen Nighthawk. The crown is down here at the 4 o'clock position, just to keep it out of the way. And maybe also to remind you of some of the great Seiko field watches out there. And I also love the addition of drilled lugs here, making strap changes easy. Flip the watch over, and you have one of the coolest casebacks Helm's made, where it looks like a laser-etched map with a Helm logo there as the compass. Then back to the front, and underneath the flat sapphire crystal is the dial. Currently, Helm has 3 different colorways, one of which is fully lumed. But the classic black appealed to me the most. And the overall dial design here is that of a classic field watch, with just some interesting twists. Like there's a vertical day date that's integrated down there at the 6. And I'm always a sucker for a good day date. As well as there's this 2-tiered chapter ring at the very outer edge. Now, there's no getting around it. When you first look at it, it does look like a pretty busy dial. But I think once you take it in, once you realize how it all flows together, you realize there's some very intelligently designed elements here. Ones that may seem odd at certain angles or when you're zoomed in on macro. But when the watch is used normally, when you're looking at it at wrist length, I think it all blends together in an effective design. For instance, there's the 24-hour track, the logo, and the text that's all there on the dial. And that maybe makes up the bulk of the clutter. But notice that it's very faded, kind of this dark gray. And because of that, it doesn't really distract from the brighter whites of the indices or hands. I mean, those elements are there when you look for them, but at a quick glance, you barely notice them. And I think the same could be said for the minute indicators on the angled portion of the chapter ring, the ones here in between the arrows. Because when you're looking straight down at the watch, those almost look like shadows of the minute track on the flatter, more raised portion of the chapter ring. And then at the same time, these arrows, which may look a little odd at certain angles, again, looking straight down, and they seem to shrink to almost a small nub. More there just to kind of guide your eyes in. And all while this two-tiered chapter ring adds a tremendous amount of depth to what would otherwise be a flatter field watch, despite it also looking maybe a little bit odd at certain angles. We also can't forget about the LUME here, and LUME is excellent. And I even love that they loomed up the day date. In my longevity test, the dial fades out about the same time as my Seiko diver, which I have to say is really good for a printed dial. But the hands here keep going, and they keep up with some of the best watches I've got. So LUME here, just like every other Helm, shouldn't disappoint. In fact, the only thing that I think might disappoint you is the bracelet, and even then, it may only be a little bit. Now, like I said before, it is extremely comfortable on the wrist, despite the watch looking like it needs to go to fat camp. And I think a lot of that comfort is from the blasted Jubilee bracelet. There's female end links, fully articulating solid links, there's a good taper, as well as a lot of options with the 6 micro adjustment points on the clasp. And unlike a lot of other blasted watches I've seen, the end links look like they actually belong to the watch. Because sometimes the coloring, the finishing, the luster, whatever you want to call it, looks a little bit off from the case, and maybe that's true here just a little bit. But I think for the most part, it looks like it belongs. However, let's get to the part that might disappoint you. And again, I think it only disappoints you a little bit. And I think that this is a problem these days with Helm in general. And that's that they simply haven't kept up with the other micros or the AliExpress watches with their bracelets. Because with this one, there's no quick release or an on-the-fly adjustable clasp, or even a fully milled clasp. I mean, the hinge here is nice and beefy, but the rest of it is pressed. And there isn't even a push-button release for the clasp, it's just kind of this old-school friction. Now, for the price, I think you can excuse a lot of that. And like I've said with other reviews in the past, when it comes to bracelets, how it wears is the real proof in the pudding, so to speak. So even though it does wear great, and I think you could only hold this against it so much, it's still one area that I think Helm is lacking compared to the rest of the market. A couple of weeks ago, when someone heard I was working on a review for Helm, they asked me what the appeal was. It was something they just didn't get. They want to know what the point of Helm was and how did it ever develop, let alone maintain the cult following it has. And after thinking about it and realizing that this watch reminds me a lot of some of those classic affordable Seiko field watches, the ones I got when I first started collecting, I realized that the appeal of Helm basically comes down to the idea of a Seiko done right, where they're producing high-value, affordable watches that simply don't disappoint. Kind of like how Seiko used to. And I think this is especially true of their divers, as they're one of the few micro brands to actually go through the process of getting their divers ISO rated. Which, let's be honest here, is really important to Seiko fans. I mean, for some of the hardcore fanboys, if it doesn't say divers on the dial, they don't even take a second look at it. So I think that's how a lot of this started, and it's just continued. Now, for all of you AliExpress fans who are kind of pointing this and saying, hey, they aren't the only ones to have some high-value great watches, you're not wrong in that. But one thing to realize is that Helm's reputation was built long before the Ollie brands even got their act together. I mean, 5-6 years ago, the Ollie watch scene was a mess, and San Martin wasn't even on anyone's radar. And back then, when it came to really high value, great watches that didn't disappoint, Helm was kind of the only player in the game. And that's sort of the bottom line with Helm and the bottom line of the Togiak here. At 265 bucks, it's an affordable original field watch that simply doesn't disappoint. It's a solid built tool watch through and through, with an interesting and engaging design. And I have to say, it's one I like more and more every time I wear it. Honestly, when I first saw this thing, when I pulled it out of the box, I wasn't quite sure about it. But the more I wear it, the more I think it's a solid keeper. Now, as usual, you guys know what to do down below, but the most important thing is to let me know what you think about this one. How do you think it stacks up against other watches out there, and what do you think about Helm in general? And as always, I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.